Saturn floats in our night sky like a jewel. You have seen it in photographs your entire life. Glowing rings, golden atmosphere, familiar and beautiful. But Saturn is hiding something from you. It is not the nearby neighbour your intuition believes it to be. It sits so far from Earth that sunlight needs 80 minutes just to touch its cloud tops. A message sent from Saturn would take over an hour to reach home. A rescue mission launched from Earth would arrive years too late to save anyone. The first human beings to reach Saturn would cross a boundary that no one fully discusses. They would enter a distance so extreme that Earth would stop being a place they could return to and begin becoming a memory they could only carry. This is the terrifying truth. If you want to understand why our own solar system already contains distances capable of breaking every human connection to home, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help us keep making these deep explorations for you. Now, settle in and get yourself comfortable. Let's begin. You already know Saturn. You have known it your entire life. It is the planet with the rings. The golden giant floating in the outer solar system, surrounded by that impossible halo of ice and rock that no other world can match. You drew it in crayon when you were 6 years old. You saw it on the cover of every astronomy book in your school library. You watched documentaries where the camera swept across its cloud bands while orchestral music swelled in the background. Saturn is the planet that makes people fall in love with space. And that is exactly the problem, because Saturn is not what your intuition tells you it is. It is not a slightly farther version of Mars. It is not the next logical step after Jupiter. It is not a destination that sits patiently in our cosmic backyard, waiting for the day when human technology catches up to its beauty. Saturn occupies a region of the solar system so remote, so fundamentally separated from everything human beings have ever experienced, that reaching it would not simply be a longer mission, it would be a different category of existence. And the fact that Saturn looks so familiar, so inviting, so endlessly photogenic, is precisely what makes it dangerous. It tricks you into thinking you understand the distance. You do not. Start with what we think we know. Saturn is the 6th planet from the Sun. It orbits at an average distance of approximately 886 million miles. In astronomical units, the standard measuring stick where 1 unit equals the distance from the Sun to Earth, Saturn sits at 9.5. It is a gas giant, the 2nd largest planet in our solar system after Jupiter, with an equatorial diameter roughly 9 times that of Earth. If Earth were the size of a nickel, Saturn would be about as large as a volleyball. Its atmosphere is mostly hydrogen and helium, whipped into bands and storms by winds that can exceed 1,600 feet per second at the equator. Its famous hexagonal jet stream at the North Pole spans 20,000 miles across. It has 274 confirmed moons at the latest count, including Titan, the only moon in the solar system with a dense atmosphere and stable liquid on its surface, and Enceladus, a tiny ice world that shoots geysers of water vapor into space from a subsurface ocean. These are extraordinary facts, but they are the kind of facts that make Saturn feel knowable, approachable, almost friendly. You hear those numbers and you think, yes, Saturn is big and far away, but we have studied it. We have sent spacecraft there. We have orbited it, photographed it, landed a probe on one of its moons. Surely it is within our reach. 4 spacecraft have visited the Saturn system. Pioneer 11 arrived in 1979, flying within 20,000 kilometers of the planet's cloud tops during a brief flyby. Voyager 1 followed in 1980, returning the first high-resolution images of Saturn's rings and moons. Voyager 2 passed through in 1981, gathering additional data on the atmosphere and ring system. And then came Cassini-Huygens, the mission that changed everything we understood about Saturn. Huygens in 1997, the Cassini orbiter arrived at Saturn in 2004 after a journey of nearly 7 years. It carried with it the Huygens probe, built by the European Space Agency, which descended through Titan's thick orange atmosphere in January 2005 and landed on the Moon's surface. It was the first and only landing on a world in the outer solar system. Cassini itself spent 13 years orbiting Saturn, returning tens of thousands of images and enough scientific data to keep researchers busy for decades. Among its discoveries were the liquid methane lakes on Titan, the water ice geysers erupting from Enceladus, new moons hiding within the ring system, and a breathtaking portrait of Earth itself, captured from Saturn's orbit as a tiny pale blue dot suspended in the darkness beyond the rings. That image, taken on July 19, 2013, is one of the most famous photographs in the history of space exploration. It shows Earth as a barely visible point of light, almost lost in the glare of Saturn's rings. From Saturn's distance, our entire world, every person, every city, every ocean, every war, every love story, reduces to a speck smaller than a single pixel. Cassini saw us from Saturn, and what it saw was almost nothing. But Cassini was a robot. It did not care how small Earth looked. It did not feel loneliness when its radio signals took over an hour to reach home. It did not panic when a fault occurred in its camera platform during the Voyager 2 flyby decades earlier, and mission controllers had to wait hours for confirmation that the problem had been resolved. Machines operate at Saturn with patience that humans cannot replicate, because machines do not experience time the way biological minds do. A 3-hour round-trip communication delay is meaningless to a spacecraft that can sit in orbit for a decade without complaint. It is devastating to a person who needs to hear another human voice. Right now, as you listen to this, a new robotic mission to Saturn is being built. NASA's Dragonfly is a nuclear-powered rotorcraft, a car-sized drone designed to fly through Titan's thick nitrogen atmosphere and hop between landing sites on its surface. The mission passed its critical design review in 2024, and construction of the spacecraft began in March 2026 at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. It is scheduled to launch in July 2028 on a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket from Kennedy Space Center. After a 6-year cruise including an Earth gravity assist, Dragonfly will arrive at Titan in 2034. It will spend over 3 years flying to dozens of locations across Titan's surface, studying prebiotic chemistry and searching for the chemical building blocks of life. Dragonfly is a remarkable mission. It represents one of the most ambitious acts of exploration ever attempted. But notice the timeline. Launch in 2028, arrival in 2034, 6 years of transit. And that is for a robotic spacecraft with no life support systems, no food, no water, no air, no crew quarters, no psychological support, no medical bay, and no need to come home. Dragonfly will fly to Titan and never return. Its nuclear power source will eventually degrade, its instruments will fall silent, and it will sit on Titan's frozen surface forever. A monument to human curiosity abandoned in the outer solar system. That is an acceptable fate for a machine. It is not an acceptable fate for a person. Yet the familiarity of Saturn, the fact that we have visited it, studied it, named its moons, mapped its rings, makes it dangerously easy to imagine sending humans there. The gap between robotic exploration and human presence is not a gap of technology alone. It is a gap of biology, psychology, and the fundamental limits of what human beings can endure. And that gap begins with distance. Let me show you what Saturn's distance actually means. The average distance from Saturn to the Sun is approximately 1,427,000,000 kilometers. At its closest approach to Earth, when both planets align on the same side of the Sun during what astronomers call opposition, Saturn is still roughly 746 million miles away, or about 8 astronomical units. At its farthest, when the Sun sits between Earth and Saturn, the distance stretches to over 1 billion miles, roughly 11 astronomical units. These numbers are so large they slide off the surface of your mind, so let me try to make them stick. Mars, the planet that dominates every conversation about human space exploration, orbits the Sun at an average distance of 1.5 astronomical units. At its closest approach to Earth, Mars comes within roughly 34 million miles. That is the distance humanity is struggling to cross right now. Every Mars mission architecture, every life support study, every radiation shielding proposal, every landing system design is built around the challenge of covering 34 million miles with human beings inside, and we are finding it extraordinarily difficult. The transit alone would take approximately 7 months with current propulsion. The crew would face significant radiation exposure, muscle atrophy, bone density loss, and psychological strain during that period. The communication delay at Mars ranges from about 4 minutes at closest approach to roughly 22 minutes at maximum distance. Even that relatively modest delay creates serious operational challenges. Mission Control cannot guide a Mars crew in real time. Every emergency response must be handled with significant autonomy. Now, consider Saturn. At its closest, Saturn is roughly 22 times farther from Earth than Mars is at its closest. 22 times. If getting to Mars is like crossing a wide river, getting to Saturn is like crossing an ocean. Not a metaphorical ocean, a literal ocean of empty space that dwarfs every distance humanity has ever contemplated traveling. Here is another way to see it. Light, the fastest thing in the universe, takes about 8 minutes and 20 seconds to travel from the Sun to Earth. That same sunlight needs approximately 80 minutes to reach Saturn. When you look at Saturn through a telescope tonight, the light entering your eye left the planet over an hour ago. You are not seeing Saturn as it exists now. You are seeing where it was and how it looked more than an hour in the past. Every observation of Saturn is an act of looking backward through time. A radio signal travelling at light speed from Earth to Saturn takes between 70 and 90 minutes depending on the orbital positions of both planets. That is a one-way trip. If a crew at Saturn sent a message to Earth saying there is a problem, and Earth immediately replied with instructions, the crew would not receive that reply for 2.5 to 3 hours after they first reported the emergency. 3 hours. In a spacecraft, where a hull breach can kill in minutes and a fire can consume an oxygen supply in seconds, 3 hours might as well be 3 centuries. Help would always arrive too late to matter. To grasp the scale, imagine building a model of the inner solar system on a football field. Place the Sun at one end zone. Earth sits at about the 1-yard line. Mars is at the 1.5-yard line. These are the worlds humanity is learning to reach. The entire zone of human spaceflight experience, from the Moon to the International Space Station to every proposed Mars mission, fits within the first 2 yards of the football field. Saturn sits at the 9.5-yard line, not the other end zone, not even midfield, just the 9.5-yard line. And yet that seemingly modest distance, measured in yards on a model, represents a chasm so vast that crossing it would take years of human life and would sever almost every connection between the crew and the world they left behind. The problem is that your brain refuses to process this. Human intuition evolved to handle distances you can walk, maybe distances you can see to the horizon on a clear day. A few miles, a few dozen miles at most. Millions of miles is already beyond intuitive comprehension. Hundreds of millions of miles enters a realm where numbers stop meaning anything at all. You can hear the words 750 million miles, but your brain does not construct an actual spatial image. It simply files the number under very far and moves on. This is why Saturn's distance is so dangerous. It hides behind its own incomprehensibility. You cannot fear what you cannot feel, but the crews who would fly to Saturn would feel it every single day. Not as a number, but as silence, as delay. As the growing awareness that the blue dot behind them is getting smaller and the golden giant ahead of them is getting larger. And somewhere in between those 2 points, they would cross an invisible line where Earth stops being a place they can reach and starts being a place they can only remember. There is a term in spaceflight psychology for the moment when astronauts first see Earth from space and experience an overwhelming sense of interconnectedness and fragility. It is called the overview effect. Astronauts on the International Space Station describe it as life-changing. They look down at Earth and see no borders, no divisions, just one delicate world hanging in the void. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine watching Earth shrink, not over minutes during a launch, but over months and years during a transit to Saturn. Imagine watching it dwindle from a bright blue marble to a small dot to a faint point of light, barely distinguishable from the background stars. Imagine reaching Saturn and looking back toward the inner solar system and not being able to find Earth at all without consulting a navigation computer. Cassini showed us what Earth looks like from Saturn. It looks like almost nothing. A mote, a pixel, a speck of light that could be mistaken for a dim star if you did not know exactly where to look. That is what home would become for a Saturn crew. Not a world, not a place, a pixel. Everything humanity has learned about Saturn so far has been learned at the cost of time, money, and engineering brilliance, but not at the cost of human lives. Pioneer and the Voyagers flew past. Cassini orbited for 13 years and then deliberately plunged into Saturn's atmosphere to avoid contaminating its potentially habitable moons. Huygens descended to Titan's surface and transmitted data for about 3 hours before its batteries died. Dragonfly will spend years exploring Titan using nuclear power, and it will never come home. Every one of these missions was expendable. Everyone was designed with the understanding that the machine would not return. The engineering accepted this from the beginning. Human missions cannot accept this. Or rather, they can, but the acceptance carries a weight that no robotic mission has ever borne. When you send a machine to Saturn, you lose hardware. When you send a person, you lose someone's entire world. Their family loses them not in a sudden catastrophe, but slowly, over years, as the distance stretches the connection thinner and thinner until it becomes something that resembles communication but no longer functions as presence. Saturn is beautiful. It is scientifically magnificent. Its ring system alone contains billions of particles of ice and rock ranging from grains of sand to boulders the size of houses, spread across a disk nearly 282,000 kilometers wide, but in places only 10 meters thick. Its moon Titan has methane rain, hydrocarbon rivers, and seas of liquid ethane and methane near its poles. Its moon Enceladus has a subsurface ocean of liquid water that may harbour conditions suitable for microbial life. There is enough scientific justification to send missions to the Saturn system for the next century, but scientific justification is not the same as human capability. We can build robots that survive at Saturn. We have proven that. What we have not proven, and what the distance itself calls into question, is whether human beings can survive not the physical journey, but the psychological reality of being that far from everything they have ever known. And here is where the beautiful lie begins to crack. Saturn appears in our sky as a steady golden point of light. You can see it with your naked eye. It moves slowly against the background stars, completing one orbit around the Sun every 29.5 Earth years. During its 2026 opposition in October, it will sit approximately 784 million miles from Earth, shining at magnitude 0.3, brighter than most stars. You could step outside, look up, and find it without a telescope. It feels close. It feels like part of the neighborhood. It is not. Saturn is the beginning of a different solar system. The inner planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, are rocky worlds huddled close to the Sun, separated by tens of millions of miles. They orbit quickly. They are warmed by solar energy. Spacecraft can reach them in months. Communication delays are measured in minutes. The inner solar system is the zone where human spaceflight, as we currently understand it, is at least theoretically possible. Beyond the asteroid belt, the solar system transforms. Distances multiply. Temperatures plunge. Solar energy drops off with the square of distance, meaning that at Saturn, sunlight is roughly 1% as intense as it is at Earth. The Sun itself, seen from Saturn, would appear as a bright but small disk, still unmistakably the Sun, but no longer the dominant furnace that defines daily life on Earth. Solar panels become nearly useless. Missions to Saturn use nuclear power, radioisotope thermoelectric generators, because the sun can no longer provide enough energy to run a spacecraft, let alone sustain a human habitat. Saturn marks the threshold. It is the first major planet where distance transforms from a logistical challenge into something closer to a permanent condition. Getting there takes years, communicating takes hours, returning takes years more, and none of these timelines can be meaningfully compressed with any technology that exists or is likely to exist within the next several decades. The distance is just the beginning. What matters is what the distance does to time, to communication, to rescue, to the human ability to feel connected to a world that keeps moving forward without you. Saturn is far enough from Earth that the journey itself becomes a kind of transformation. You leave as a person with a home. Somewhere along the way, measured not in miles but in months and years of silence, you become a person with a memory of a home. But before we get to what happens inside the mind of a Saturn-bound crew, we need to understand exactly what the transit looks like. How long the journey takes under real propulsion, what the communication delay actually feels like in practice, what it means to realize, months into the crossing, that the last real-time conversation you will ever have with another human being on Earth has already happened, and you did not even know it was the last one. That story comes next, and it is far worse than the distance alone suggests. There is a moment during every deep space mission when the spacecraft crosses an invisible line, not a physical boundary, not a gravitational threshold, a human one. It is the moment when the delay between sending a message and receiving a reply becomes long enough that the conversation stops feeling like a conversation. On the International Space Station, orbiting just 250 miles above Earth, that moment never arrives. Communication is effectively instantaneous. Astronauts video call their families, talk to mission control in real time, and watch live news broadcasts. Earth is right there, enormous and blue, filling the windows. On a mission to the Moon, the delay is roughly 1.3 seconds each way, barely noticeable. Apollo astronauts spoke with Houston in something close to normal rhythm. A slight pause, a tiny hesitation, but nothing that broke the feeling of being heard. On a mission to Mars, the line gets crossed somewhere in the first few weeks after departure. The delay climbs from seconds to minutes. At 4 minutes each way, conversations become strained. At 10 minutes, they become impractical. At 22 minutes, the maximum one-way delay when Mars and Earth are on opposite sides of the Sun, real-time dialogue is gone entirely. You speak into the void. You wait. Nearly 45 minutes later, you hear a response to what you said 3/4 of an hour ago. Mars astronauts will experience this as a slow-motion disconnection, a fading signal that stretches the elastic band between themselves and home until it becomes thin and fragile. On a mission to Saturn, that elastic band does not stretch, it snaps. At Saturn's distance from Earth, a one-way radio signal takes between 70 and 90 minutes to arrive, depending on the orbital configuration of both planets. A round-trip exchange, the simplest possible unit of human interaction, a question asked and an answer received, consumes 2.5 to 3 hours. This is not a communication delay. This is a communication collapse. The very architecture of human conversation, the rhythm of call and response, of interruption and laughter, of silence that means something because the other person is right there listening, all of it disintegrates across that gap. What remains is something closer to letter writing. Messages composed in solitude, transmitted into silence, received by people who have already moved on to other thoughts by the time the words arrive. But before a crew ever experiences that delay at full strength, they must first survive the transit. And the transit to Saturn is not a journey in any sense that human experience has prepared us to understand. It is a sentence. Begin with propulsion. Every spacecraft that has ever reached Saturn used chemical rockets combined with gravitational assists from other planets to build enough velocity for the crossing. Pioneer 11 launched in 1973 and reached Saturn 6.5 years later, using Jupiter's gravity to redirect its trajectory. Voyager 1 launched in 1977 and arrived at Saturn in 3 years because its trajectory was optimized for the outer planets. Voyager 2 took 4 years. Cassini-Huygens, the most sophisticated Saturn mission ever flown, launched in 1997 and did not arrive until 2004, nearly 7 years later. Its flight path included 2 gravity assists from Venus, one from Earth and one from Jupiter. The spacecraft looped through the inner solar system multiple times before it had enough energy to coast out to Saturn's orbit. These timelines were acceptable for robots. They are catastrophic for humans. 7 years is not a transit time. It is a significant fraction of an adult human life. A crew that departed Earth at age 35 would arrive at Saturn at age 42. Their muscles would have atrophied despite whatever exercise regime the mission imposed. Their bones would have lost density. Their cardiovascular systems would have adapted to microgravity in ways that would make readapting to any gravitational environment painful and potentially dangerous. Their cumulative radiation exposure from galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events would be severe, raising lifetime cancer risks substantially. And all of this assumes nothing goes wrong with the spacecraft during nearly a decade of continuous operation in deep space. No critical system failures, no micrometeorite strikes, no slow degradation of life support components that were never designed to run for 7 uninterrupted years. Could we do better? Possibly. Nuclear thermal propulsion, a technology that NASA's been studying off and on since the 1960s, could significantly reduce transit times by providing higher thrust and greater fuel efficiency than chemical rockets. A nuclear thermal engine heats hydrogen propellant using a fission reactor and expels it at far higher velocities than chemical combustion can achieve. Depending on mission architecture and trajectory design, nuclear thermal propulsion might cut the transit to Saturn to somewhere between 3 and 5 years for a crewed vehicle carrying the mass required for life support, radiation shielding, consumables, and a habitat large enough for a small crew to survive without losing their minds. 3 to 5 years. Let that settle. The most optimistic, realistic propulsion technology that engineers can currently envision would still require a crew to spend 3 to 5 years inside a spacecraft just to reach Saturn, not to explore it, not to return from it, just to get there. Some researchers have explored even more aggressive options. A 2025 study from the University of North Dakota examined nuclear fission propulsion system sizing for a human-class mission to Titan, targeting a 1 to 2 year transit window. The study acknowledged that such performance would require propulsion parameters well beyond any system that has been built or tested. These are paper concepts. They represent the outer edge of theoretical ambition, not engineering reality. No nuclear thermal rocket has ever flown a crewed mission. No nuclear electric propulsion system has ever pushed a human habitat through deep space. The technology exists in laboratories, in computer simulations, and in budget proposals that have been repeatedly deferred for decades. The honest answer, the one that mission planners would have to present to any crew asked to fly to Saturn, is this. You will spend somewhere between 3 and 7 years getting there. The number depends on propulsion technology that may or may not be ready by the time the mission launches, and once you arrive, the return journey will take just as long. Now consider what those years of transit would do to the human body before the crew ever reaches Saturn. On Earth, you are shielded. The planet's magnetic field deflects the majority of charged particles streaming from the Sun and from deep space. The atmosphere absorbs most of what the magnetic field does not catch. You live your entire life inside a cocoon of protection so effective that you never think about it. On the International Space Station, orbiting within the inner magnetosphere, astronauts receive elevated but still manageable radiation doses, roughly equivalent to several chest X-rays every single day. The station's relatively short mission durations and its position within Earth's protective field keep the cumulative exposure within acceptable career limits for most astronauts. Beyond Earth's magnetosphere, that protection vanishes. A crew transiting to Saturn would spend years in interplanetary space, exposed to 2 relentless sources of radiation, Solar particle events, the bursts of high-energy protons ejected during solar flares and coronal mass ejections, deliver acute doses that can cause radiation sickness if shielding is insufficient. These events are intermittent but unpredictable, and a severe one could force the crew into a heavily shielded storm shelter for hours or days, interrupting operations and spiking anxiety. The second source is more insidious. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy nuclei originating from supernova remnants and other violent astrophysical events, bombard the spacecraft continuously. Unlike solar particles, which can be partially blocked by conventional shielding, galactic cosmic rays are so energetic that they penetrate most materials. When they strike metal hull walls, they produce secondary showers of neutrons and other particles that can be more biologically damaging than the original ray. Adding more shielding can paradoxically increase secondary radiation exposure. There is no simple engineering fix. NASA's Human Research Program identifies space radiation as one of the top 5 risks for deep space missions. The concern is not limited to long-term cancer probability, though that alone is serious. A multi-year transit beyond the magnetosphere would expose the crew to cumulative doses high enough to raise the risk of cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and central nervous system effects that are only now beginning to be understood. Studies on rodent models exposed to simulated galactic cosmic ray environments have shown measurable changes in brain white matter, reduced performance on spatial memory tasks, and increased markers of neuroinflammation. Translating animal studies directly to humans requires caution, but the direction of the evidence is troubling. The radiation environment of a Saturn transit may not only threaten the crew's long-term health, it may gradually degrade the cognitive sharpness they need to operate the spacecraft, diagnose problems, and make life or death decisions. The mission would be slowly eroding the crew's most critical asset, their minds, for years before they even arrive. The skeletal and muscular deterioration is equally relentless. In microgravity, the human body sheds what it does not need. Bones that no longer bear weight lose mineral density at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per month. Muscles that no longer fight gravity atrophy, despite hours of daily resistance exercise. On the space station, where missions last 6 to 12 months, these effects are significant but recoverable. Astronauts return to Earth weakened, but with months of rehabilitation they regain most of their pre-flight bone density and muscle mass. The countermeasures, resistance training devices, nutritional supplements, bisphosphonate medications, are designed for that time frame. A 3 to 7 year transit breaks those countermeasures. The exercise equipment must function continuously for years without replacement parts. The crew must maintain motivation to perform grueling daily workouts, not for months, but for the better part of a decade. Nutritional supplements degrade over time, and the cumulative bone loss, compounding month after month for years, enters territory where fracture risk becomes genuinely dangerous. A crew member who has lost 20 to 30% of their bone mineral density is at serious risk of breaking a hip or a vertebra during any activity involving impact or load bearing. If the mission profile includes surface operations on Titan, where gravity is roughly 1/7 of Earth's, the crew might arrive physically incapable of performing them safely. They might reach Saturn only to find that their own bodies have become obstacles to the mission they spent years traveling to accomplish. Cardiovascular deconditioning adds another layer. The heart, accustomed to pumping blood against Earth's gravity, adapts to microgravity by becoming slightly smaller and less efficient. Blood volume decreases, fluid redistributes toward the head, causing facial puffiness and elevated intracranial pressure that may contribute to the vision changes observed in many long-duration ISS astronauts. Over a multi-year transit, these cardiovascular changes would deepen. The crew's hearts would become progressively less capable of supporting activity in any gravitational environment. Readaptation upon reaching Titan or returning to Earth would be painful, prolonged, and medically risky. And while their bodies weaken, their star shrinks. This is a detail that rarely appears in mission analyses, but it would be one of the most psychologically potent experiences of the transit. During the outbound journey, the crew would watch the sun diminish, Not metaphorically, physically. At Earth's distance, the sun is a blazing disk that dominates the sky. Too bright to look at, too powerful to ignore. It is the source of warmth, light, seasons, and the circadian rhythms that regulate human biology. It is, in the most literal sense, the center of every human life that has ever been lived. At Mars, roughly 1.5 astronomical units from the sun, sunlight is still strong, about 43% of its intensity at Earth. Noticeably dimmer, but still recognizably the sun. At Jupiter, 5 astronomical units out, the sun delivers roughly 4% of its Earth-level intensity. It is still bright enough to cast sharp shadows, but the quality of the light has changed. It feels thinner, colder. At Saturn, 9.5 astronomical units from the sun, the intensity drops to barely 1% of what it is at Earth. The sun is still the brightest object in the sky, still unmistakably a star rather than a point of light, but it no longer feels like the furnace that defined every outdoor moment of the crew's previous lives. It is a bright but distant lamp. The shadows it casts are softer. The warmth it provides through the spacecraft's hull is negligible. Solar panels, the backbone of power generation for every crewed mission in history, are essentially useless. The crew relies on nuclear energy because their star can no longer sustain them. Watching this happen over years would be unlike any human sensory experience. The sun does not suddenly switch off, it fades. Month after month, the disk grows a fraction smaller, the light a fraction weaker, the sense of solar proximity a fraction more remote. The crew would experience this as a slow disconnection not just from Earth, but from the star that makes Earth possible. They would journey into a region of the solar system where the sun is still visible but no longer dominant, where its warmth is a memory and its light is a reminder of the distance they have crossed. No human being has ever watched their star shrink over the course of years. The psychological effect is unstudied and unknown, but it would add to the cumulative sense of departure, of leaving not just a planet but an entire zone of solar warmth and moving into something colder, darker, and vastly more indifferent. Now imagine what those years feel like from inside. You launch from Earth. The first few days resemble every crewed mission in history. The planet shrinks behind you, but it is still there, still enormous, still obviously home. Communication with mission control is near instantaneous. You report system status. You receive encouragement. You settle into the routines that will define your life for years to come. The delay is seconds, then minutes, then tens of minutes. Then, somewhere in the first few months, you cross the orbit of Mars. Earth is now a bright star behind you, and the delay has reached 20 minutes or more. Conversations with home become staggered. You say good morning to your daughter, and by the time her reply reaches you, it is afternoon. She has moved on to homework, to dinner, to sleep. You are talking to a ghost of her morning self, and she is talking to a ghost of your afternoon self, and neither of you is truly present to the other. The months continue. You pass through the asteroid belt. Earth is no longer the brightest object behind you. It dims. The sun itself, while still brilliant, is noticeably smaller than the blazing disk you knew from home. The delay passes 40 minutes, then 50, then 60. Somewhere around the halfway point of the transit, you realize something that no training simulation fully prepared you for. You have stopped expecting replies. You have stopped structuring your messages as part of a conversation and started structuring them as dispatches, reports from the field, updates from a place that nobody on Earth can see or visit or truly understand. You dictate your words into a microphone, compress them into a data packet, transmit them toward a planet you can no longer distinguish from the surrounding stars, and then you go back to work. Hours later, a response arrives. It addresses concerns you raised hours before that. Your state of mind has shifted. The context has changed. The reply feels like it belongs to a different conversation, one that happened in a parallel version of your day that no longer exists. This is the communication delay as a lived experience, not a technical inconvenience. Not a latency problem that engineers might someday optimize away. A fundamental rewiring of what it means to talk to another human being. At Saturn distance, you do not converse with Earth. You exchange monologues separated by chasms of time, each one arriving slightly out of phase with the reality it tries to address. The psychological research on communication delay in spaceflight is sobering. Studies conducted in analog environments, isolated habitats designed to simulate deep space conditions, have shown that even simulated delays of 20 minutes each way produce measurable increases in crew frustration, emotional withdrawal, and interpersonal tension. Crew members in these studies reported feeling increasingly disconnected from support teams on the outside. They began to rely more heavily on each other and less on external guidance. They described a sense of being forgotten, even when they knew intellectually that ground teams were monitoring their every move. At 20 minutes of delay, these effects were significant. At 70 to 90 minutes, they would be transformative. Consider what a Saturn crew would lose. They would lose the ability to share an experience in real time with anyone outside their spacecraft. If they witnessed something extraordinary, a close approach to Saturn's rings, a view of Titan's methane seas glinting in the distant sunlight, the awe would belong to them alone. By the time a description reached Earth and a response came back, the moment would be nearly 3 hours gone. Joy without shared immediacy becomes something quieter, something lonelier. It becomes a memory you describe rather than an experience you inhabit together. They would lose the ability to receive comfort in the moment it is needed. A crew member who wakes from a nightmare about a family emergency, who feels the crushing weight of isolation pressing down at 3 a.m. spacecraft time, cannot call home and hear a familiar voice. They can record a message, they can send it, they can wait, and while they wait, they must find their own way back from the edge, because the voice they need is over an hour away in each direction. They would lose the ability to participate in earthly time, birthdays, holidays, elections, crises, celebrations. All of these would reach the crew as delayed bulletins from a world that is living without them. A crew member's child takes their first steps. The video arrives 78 minutes later. The crew member cries, records a response, sends it back. The child will see that response more than 2 hours after the steps happened. By then, the child has moved on to something else entirely. The parent's tears arrive into a household that is already past the moment. The emotional connection, the thing that makes human relationships feel real and alive, requires a shared present tense. At Saturn distance, the shared present tense does not exist. Now compound this with the duration. These conditions do not last for a few weeks or a few months. They last for years. A crew in transit to Saturn would spend 3 to 7 years experiencing escalating communication delay, watching it grow from seconds to minutes to tens of minutes to over an hour, with no relief and no reversal. The delay does not fluctuate much once the spacecraft reaches Saturn distance. It is a permanent feature of the crew's reality for the entire time they remain in the outer solar system. If the mission includes time at Saturn for exploration, perhaps orbiting the planet, visiting moons, conducting science, add another year or 2. If the mission profile includes a return to Earth, add another 3 to 7 years of transit during which the delay slowly shrinks. But the crew has already been reshaped by years of living without it. The total mission clock for a realistic Saturn round trip, including transit, operations, and return, spans roughly 8 to 15 years depending on propulsion and mission design. 15 years. That is longer than many marriages last. Longer than childhood. Longer than the entire career of most professionals. A person who departs for Saturn in their early 30s would return, if everything goes perfectly, in their mid-40s. They would come back to a world that has changed in ways they could only observe through time-delayed transmissions. Their children would be adults. Their parents might be dead. The political landscape, the cultural landscape, the technological landscape would all have shifted beneath them while they hung suspended in the void, unable to participate, unable to influence, unable to do anything except watch the dispatches arrive and know that by the time they read them, the world had already moved on. There is a term in psychology for the distress caused by significant life events that occur while a person is absent and unable to respond. It does not have a clean clinical name because the condition is rare in ordinary life, but it is well documented among military personnel deployed for extended periods, among prisoners serving long sentences, and among isolated researchers stationed in Antarctica for overwinter missions lasting 8 to 14 months. In all of these cases, the duration of separation is measured in months, occasionally in a year or two. The psychological toll is real and well studied. Depression, anxiety, identity disruption, relationship dissolution, and a painful sense of being a stranger in one's own life upon return are all common outcomes. A Saturn crew would face this same toll amplified by a factor that existing research has never measured, because no human being has ever been separated from home for a decade or more while remaining conscious, aware, and able to observe the life they are missing. A prisoner at least shares the same planet, the same time zone of experience with the people they left behind. A Saturn crew shares nothing except electromagnetic signals that arrive too late to matter. And here is the element that transforms delay from hardship into something more fundamental. It is not just that communication is slow, it is that the slowness changes the nature of the relationship between the crew and Earth. At Saturn distance, mission control cannot guide a crew through an emergency. Ground teams cannot walk an astronaut through a medical procedure step by step, adjusting instructions based on what they see happening. They cannot help diagnose a mechanical failure in real time. They cannot observe a situation unfolding and say, "Stop, wait, do not do that, try this instead." By the time they receive a report that something has gone wrong, the something has been going wrong for over an hour. By the time their advice reaches the spacecraft, nearly 3 hours have elapsed since the problem first appeared. In those 3 hours, the crew has either solved the problem themselves or they have not. Earth's input arrives as an afterthought, a Monday morning analysis of a crisis that ended over the weekend. This transforms the crew's relationship with home, from partnership to spectatorship. Earth watches, Earth comments. Earth offers wisdom that arrives with the relevance of yesterday's weather forecast. The crew acts. The crew decides. The crew lives or dies based on their own competence, their own resources, their own judgment, and nothing else. They are, in every operational sense, alone. Cassini's mission controllers experienced a version of this from the ground side. At Saturn distance, a command sent to the spacecraft took approximately 80 minutes to arrive. Confirmation that the command had been received and executed took another 80 minutes to return. Nearly 3 hours between pressing send and knowing that the instruction worked. During Cassini's most critical maneuvers, its Saturn orbit insertion burn in 2004, the spacecraft had to execute the entire sequence autonomously because the delay made real-time guidance impossible. Engineers had to trust that the software would perform correctly, that the engine would fire at the right moment, that the trajectory would be accurate. They sat in the control room and waited, knowing that whatever was happening at Saturn had already happened an hour and 20 minutes ago, and that they were powerless to change it. But Cassini was a machine. If the orbit insertion had failed, the loss would have been scientific and financial. Devastating, certainly, but not human. If a crewed spacecraft at Saturn experienced a critical failure during a maneuver, the crew would face the same delay, the same inability to receive real-time guidance, the same reliance on their own skill and the spacecraft's own systems. Except the stakes would not be data and dollars. The stakes would be air, water, warmth, and the lives of every person aboard. This is the reality of the crossing, not a heroic voyage through the cosmos, not a grand adventure with Earth cheering in the background. A slow, years-long transit through empty space during which every human connection to home is progressively degraded by the growing distance, until what remains is not connection at all but correspondence. Letters sent into the dark, answered by letters from the dark, each one arriving from a world that has already moved past the moment it describes. The delay also creates a peculiar form of informational loneliness. A Saturn crew would receive news from Earth, but always late. They would learn about events after everyone else had already reacted. A global crisis would unfold on Earth, and the crew would experience it as a series of time-lagged updates, each one describing a situation that had already evolved by the time the description arrived. They would never be part of the collective human experience of the present. They would always be behind, always observing from outside, the temporal frame that binds communities together. The crew would share a spacecraft with each other, but they would not share a moment with anyone on Earth. They would live in a bubble of permanent yesterday, and that yesterday would grow more distant as the mission continued. By the time the crew reached Saturn, 3 to 7 years after departure, the Earth they left would no longer exist. Not physically. Earth would still be there, orbiting the Sun, spinning on its axis. But the Earth they knew, the specific configuration of relationships, culture, politics, and daily life that defined their world at the moment of departure, would have dissolved into the past. Friends would have moved, neighbours would have changed, technology would have advanced. Music, language, humour, all the small shared references that make a person feel at home in their own society would have shifted in ways the crew could only partially track through delayed transmissions. They would become increasingly foreign to their own civilization, not through any fault of their own, but through the simple accumulation of time spent apart. This is what the crossing does. It does not merely move people through space. It moves them through time in a way that separates them from the human timeline they were born into. Every mile adds a millisecond of delay. Every month adds another layer of distance between the crew and the living, breathing, evolving world that was once their home. By the time Saturn's golden clouds fill the windows and the rings stretch across the sky in a spectacle that no human eye has ever witnessed, the crew will have already lost something they can never recover. Not their lives, not their health, not their sanity, necessarily, but their place in the present tense of human existence. They will have become people who live in the gap between signal and response. People for whom home is not a place, but a transmission. People who carry Earth inside their memories because the real Earth, the one that exists right now, is unreachable across a delay that no technology can eliminate and no human emotion can bridge. And they will know with absolute certainty that no one is coming to help them. Not because no one cares, but because the distance is too great, the transit too long, and the physics too unyielding for rescue to be anything more than a word. What that knowledge does to a crew, what it means to operate for years in a place where help is a theoretical concept rather than a practical possibility, is what comes next. And it is where the distance stops being a number and starts becoming a prison. Every human being who has ever left Earth's surface has been tethered to a single unspoken promise. If something goes wrong, we will come get you. That promise has been the invisible foundation beneath every crewed spaceflight in history. It has never been formally stated in those words. It does not appear in mission contracts or crew agreements, but it lives inside every decision, every system design, every abort scenario that engineers have ever built into a human spacecraft. The promise is not always easy to keep. Sometimes it requires extraordinary effort. Sometimes it comes close to failing. But it has never been broken. Not once in more than 60 years of sending people into space. A mission to Saturn would break it. Not because the engineers would choose to abandon the crew. Not because the funding would run out or the political will would fade. The promise would break because physics would not allow it to be kept. The distance between Earth and Saturn is so vast that the concept of rescue, the idea that help can be dispatched and arrive in time to matter, ceases to function. It does not become difficult. It does not become unlikely. It becomes fictional, and understanding why requires looking at every rescue architecture humanity has ever built and watching each one collapse under the weight of Saturn's remoteness. Start with the closest comparison. The International Space Station orbits Earth at an altitude of roughly 250 miles. If a critical emergency occurs on the station, the crew can evacuate. Soyuz capsules and SpaceX Crew Dragon vehicles remain permanently docked as lifeboats. In an extreme scenario, the crew climbs in, undocks, and returns to Earth's surface within hours. The ground can also launch a rescue vehicle on relatively short notice. The station is close enough that the entire global infrastructure of spaceflight can respond quickly, decisively, and with overwhelming capability. That is what rescue looks like when your destination is 250 miles away. The Apollo missions stretched this architecture, but did not break it. When an oxygen tank exploded aboard Apollo 13 in April 1970, the crew was approximately 200,000 miles from Earth. Roughly 56 hours into their translunar coast, the situation was dire. The command module lost power. Oxygen was venting into space. The crew retreated to the lunar module, a lifeboat never designed for the purpose, and began a desperate loop around the moon to slingshot back toward Earth. The return took nearly 4 days. Mission Control worked around the clock, devising power-up procedures, calculating course corrections, and guiding the crew through a re-entry sequence that had never been tested under those conditions. The crew survived because Earth was close enough for real-time communication, because the transit home was measured in days rather than years, and because the entire might of NASA's engineering corps could be brought to bear on the problem before the crew's consumables ran out. 4 days. That was the margin. 4 days between crisis and splashdown, with continuous real-time communication the entire way. The crew was never more than 1 1/3 seconds of signal delay from Houston. Every instruction, every improvisation, every critical decision was made collaboratively between the astronauts and hundreds of engineers on the ground. Apollo 13 survived because the rescue envelope, the maximum distance and time within which help can meaningfully arrive, was small enough to fit inside a human crisis. Mars stretches the rescue envelope to its absolute limit. A crew on the surface of Mars or in Mars orbit faces a communication delay of 4 to 22 minutes each way. Real-time guidance from Earth is impossible. But the transit home, depending on mission architecture and orbital mechanics, takes roughly 6 to 9 months. That is not fast. It is not comfortable. A crew facing a life-threatening emergency on Mars would need to survive on their own resources for months before they could return to Earth. But the timeline is at least conceivable. An abort trajectory can be calculated. A return vehicle can be prepared in advance. The crew can begin the journey home and arrive within a period that, while agonizing, remains within the outer bounds of human endurance during a crisis. Now extend the distance to Saturn. A crew at Saturn, roughly 8 to 10 astronomical units from Earth depending on orbital positions, faces a one-way communication delay of 70 to 90 minutes. A round-trip exchange takes 2.5 to 3 hours. These facts have already been established, but the rescue implications go far beyond communication. Imagine a critical failure aboard a crewed spacecraft in Saturn orbit. A hull breach, a reactor malfunction, a catastrophic loss of a primary life support system. The crew sends an emergency transmission to Earth. That transmission, traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second, takes over an hour to arrive. Mission Control receives it, assesses the situation, and prepares a response. Even if they react instantly, their reply takes another hour plus to reach Saturn. By the time the crew hears anything from Earth, nearly 3 hours have passed since they first reported the emergency. In that time, they have either contained the crisis themselves or they have not. Earth's response is not guidance. It is commentary on events that have already resolved, one way or another. But communication delay is not even the real problem. The real problem is transit time. Suppose the crew's situation is not immediately fatal but is unsustainable. Perhaps a critical system is failing slowly, giving them weeks or months before their environment becomes unlivable. On the space station, a replacement part could be launched on a cargo vehicle within days or weeks. At Mars, a pre-positioned supply cache or a fast transit resupply mission might arrive within months if one had been planned in advance. At Saturn, there is no equivalent option. A resupply or rescue vehicle launched from Earth on the day the emergency is reported would take, at minimum, 3 years to arrive, using the most optimistic propulsion technology currently under serious development. Using conventional chemical propulsion with gravity assists, the timeline extends to 6 or 7 years. 3 years is the floor. not the expected time. The absolute best case, assuming a rescue vehicle is already built, already fueled, already sitting on a launch pad, and can depart within days of the emergency being reported. In reality, no such vehicle would be waiting. Building, testing, and launching a deep space rescue mission would take years even before the transit began. The true timeline from emergency to rescue arrival could easily span a decade. A decade. If a crew at Saturn faces a crisis that they cannot resolve with the tools, parts, and skills aboard their own spacecraft, no one on Earth can save them within any time frame that matters. Not within months. Not within years. Not within any period that a damaged spacecraft or a wounded crew could plausibly survive. The rescue envelope does not stretch to Saturn. It evaporates. This is not an engineering failure. It is not a budget problem or a policy shortcoming. It is a consequence of the geometry of the solar system. Saturn is simply too far away for Earth to function as a safety net. Any crew that travels there does so with the explicit understanding that they are beyond rescue. Whatever goes wrong, they fix it themselves or they die. There is no middle option. There is no cavalry coming over the hill. The hill is 800 million miles wide and the cavalry would need half a decade to cross it. This reality transforms every aspect of mission design. A spacecraft bound for Saturn cannot be built like a spacecraft bound for Mars. A Mars vehicle can afford some degree of risk in its redundancy planning, because Earth-based resupply is at least theoretically possible during the mission window. A Saturn vehicle cannot afford that assumption. Every critical system must be redundant. Not just double redundant, but triple redundant, because a single backup failure followed by a primary failure would leave the crew without that system for years, with no possibility of replacement. Life support becomes the most critical engineering challenge. The crew needs air, water, food, and thermal regulation for the entire duration of the mission, potentially 10 to 15 years for a round trip. Current life support technology on the International Space Station recycles water and oxygen with roughly 90% efficiency, but still requires periodic resupply of consumables, filters, and replacement parts from Earth. A Saturn-bound spacecraft would receive no resupply. Every filter, every chemical cartridge, every mechanical component of the life support system must either last for the full mission duration or be repairable using only the materials and tools carried aboard. The system must function without maintenance visits from Earth for longer than most automobiles remain operational, in an environment where a single critical failure could kill everyone aboard. Consider the water recycling challenge alone. The station's water recovery system, upgraded with a brine processor assembly in 2023, now achieves approximately 98% efficiency in short-duration demonstrations. That is an impressive figure. But it was achieved aboard a station in low Earth orbit that receives regular resupply of replacement filters, chemical reagents, and maintenance hardware every few months. The membranes degrade. The catalysts exhaust. The pumps wear. On the station, worn components are swapped out and returned to Earth for analysis. On a Saturn mission, there is no swap. There is no resupply. The water recycling system must sustain near-perfect recovery, not for months between cargo deliveries, but for 15 continuous years, using only the spare parts and consumables loaded at launch. Even a small decline in efficiency, from 98% to 95%, would compound over a decade and a half into a water deficit that could not be recovered. No closed-loop water recycling system has ever been tested at any efficiency level over that duration without external maintenance. The engineering works in the short term. Whether it works for 15 unbroken years in deep space is a question that cannot be answered with confidence, because no comparable test has ever been run. Food presents an equally stubborn problem. Current space food, the freeze-dried and thermostabilized meals that sustain ISS crews, has a certified shelf life of roughly 2 to 3 years. Beyond that window, nutritional quality degrades, vitamins break down, caloric density decreases, texture and flavor deteriorate in ways that sound trivial from Earth, but become psychologically significant when every meal for a decade comes from the same finite stockpile. Studies on Antarctic overwinter crews and submarine deployments consistently identify food quality and variety as one of the top 3 morale factors, ranking alongside communication with home and workload management. A Saturn crew eating progressively degraded rations during the later years of the mission would face not just nutritional risk, but motivational erosion at exactly the point when the mission demands the most from them. The alternative is onboard food production, growing crops inside the spacecraft using artificial light and hydroponic or aeroponic systems. This sounds appealing, and NASA has invested significant research into bioregenerative life support concepts. But growing meaningful caloric volume requires substantial space, water, energy, and maintenance. A handful of lettuce leaves under a grow light, the kind of supplementary gardening performed on the station, does not feed a crew. Producing enough calories to meaningfully offset stored food reserves would require a dedicated agricultural module with lighting powerful enough to drive photosynthesis, environmental controls to manage temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels, and crew time to plant, tend, harvest, and process crops across the full mission duration. No such system has been tested at the scale or duration a Saturn mission would require. Power generation underlies all of these challenges. A crewed habitat at Saturn would require tens of kilowatts of continuous electrical power at minimum, likely approaching 100 kilowatts when life support, thermal regulation, communication, scientific instruments, lighting, and food production are combined. The Sun cannot help at 9.5 astronomical units, where incoming solar energy drops to roughly 1% of its intensity at Earth. The only viable option for sustained power is a nuclear fission reactor, a technology that has been studied for space applications for decades, but has never been operated in space for the duration a Saturn mission would demand. The challenge is not building a reactor that works. It is building one that works for 15 years without maintenance from Earth. Every reactor has a finite fuel load. Every mechanical component in the power conversion system, turbines, generators, heat exchangers, coolant loops, has a service life. Cassini's radioisotope thermoelectric generators, a much simpler technology than a fission reactor, produced approximately 880 watts at launch, but had degraded to roughly 670 watts by the end of its 20-year lifespan. A fission reactor for a crewed habitat would need to deliver orders of magnitude more power and maintain output within acceptable margins across the full mission timeline. As available power inevitably declines, the crew would face increasingly difficult trade-offs. Less power for food production means more reliance on degrading stored rations. Less power for life support means tighter margins on air and water recycling. Less power for communication means weaker signals sent across a distance that already strains the link. The power budget would be a slowly tightening constraint that touches every other system, a quiet countdown running beneath every day of the mission. Medical support presents an equally daunting challenge. On the International Space Station, a seriously ill or injured astronaut can be evacuated to Earth within hours. On a Mars mission, the crew would include medical training and supplies sufficient to handle emergencies for the duration of the surface stay and transit. On a Saturn mission, the crew must be prepared to handle every conceivable medical emergency for a decade or more with no possibility of evacuation and no access to terrestrial hospitals, specialists, or advanced diagnostic equipment. Consider the specifics. A crew member develops appendicitis. On Earth, this is a routine surgical procedure. On the station, it triggers an evacuation. On a Saturn-bound spacecraft, it requires another crew member, likely trained as a flight surgeon but not a practicing surgeon, to perform an appendectomy in microgravity using whatever surgical tools the mission has provided, guided only by preloaded medical references and delayed text-based advice from Earth that arrives hours after it is requested. If complications develop, there is no specialist to call. There is no second opinion that arrives in time to change the surgical approach. There is only the crew, the patient, and whatever capability exists within the walls of their spacecraft. Now extend that scenario to more serious conditions. A stroke, a cardiac event. a traumatic injury from a mechanical accident, a psychological crisis severe enough to endanger the crew. Each of these requires immediate, expert, resource-intensive intervention that a small crew in a remote spacecraft cannot fully provide. The crew will have training, they will have supplies, they will have protocols, but they will not have a hospital. They will not have specialists. They will not have the ability to transfer a patient to a higher level of care, because there is no higher level of care within 1 billion miles. And then there is the challenge that mission architects discuss the least, because it has no clean engineering solution. The crew will be confined together, the same 4 to 6 people, inside a habitat the size of a modest apartment, for 10 to 15 years, with no possibility of crew rotation, no possibility of physical separation beyond the interior walls of the spacecraft, no access to any other human being in any form other than time-delayed messages from a planet they cannot see. On the International Space Station, crew rotations occur every 6 months. When personality friction develops, and it always develops, both parties know the situation is temporary. The irritating colleague will rotate home. Fresh faces will arrive. The social dynamic will reset. This knowledge acts as a psychological pressure valve, allowing crew members to tolerate small annoyances because they know the annoyances have an expiration date. Antarctic overwinter stations offer a closer analogue. Crews of 12 to 40 people spend 8 to 14 months together, with no possibility of departure during the winter. Even in this relatively short time frame, documented interpersonal problems are extensive. Cliques form. Grudges calcify. Crew members who are friends at the start of winter become adversaries by the end. Some station histories record near-violent confrontations between colleagues who had been forced to share a confined space for less than a year. One case at a Soviet Antarctic station became so severe that a crew member reportedly attacked another with an axe during a chess dispute, though the exact details remain disputed. What is not disputed is that even well-screened, well-trained professionals placed in isolated, confined environments develop interpersonal conflicts that escalate with duration. A Saturn crew would face this dynamic at a scale that dwarfs any Antarctic posting. A decade or more with the same small group, no rotation, no new arrivals, no escape to a different social environment. The crew cannot step outside for air. They cannot visit a different friend. They cannot take a solitary walk through an unfamiliar landscape. Every human interaction they have for the duration of the mission will be with the same handful of people in the same enclosed space under the same relentless operational pressure. Irritations that on Earth would be trivial, someone's way of chewing, someone's nervous habit, someone's tone during stressful moments, would become inescapable features of daily existence for longer than most people maintain any voluntary social arrangement on Earth. The crew would not merely coexist. They would be welded together by physics, unable to separate, unable to replace each other, unable to introduce any new social stimulus into a dynamic that has been running on the same interpersonal fuel for years. And if a crew member develops a serious psychological condition during the mission, the options are terrifyingly limited. Depression, anxiety, and cognitive changes are well-documented risks of long-duration isolation, even in environments far less extreme than a Saturn transit. But what happens if a crew member develops something more acute? Paranoia, psychotic symptoms, a personality change driven by cumulative stress, radiation exposure, or neurological deterioration that makes them irrational or dangerous. On the station, that person is evacuated. On Earth, they are removed from the situation. At Saturn, they cannot be removed. They remain aboard the spacecraft, in the same habitat, breathing the same recycled air, sharing the same galley, the same corridors, the same mission. The remaining crew must manage the situation indefinitely, with whatever pharmaceutical tools and behavioral protocols they have, and with the full knowledge that if management fails, there is no authority capable of intervening for years. The psychological dimension of this isolation deserves its own examination, and it will receive one before this story ends. But even from a purely operational standpoint, The impossibility of rescue changes the way the crew experiences every moment of the mission. They know. From the moment they leave Earth orbit, they know that they are on their own. That knowledge does not fade with time. It intensifies. Every minor anomaly, every unexpected sensor reading, every strange noise in the habitat module carries an additional weight that no astronaut in low Earth orbit has ever felt. Because on the station, a strange noise means you report it to Houston and someone figures it out. At Saturn, a strange noise means you figure it out yourself, or you add it to the list of uncertainties that accumulate over years, each one a small reminder that you are living inside a machine that must not fail in a place where failure is permanent. The return journey adds another dimension to this isolation. A crew that reaches Saturn and completes its mission objectives must then face the transit home, another 3 to 7 years depending on propulsion and orbital mechanics. The total absence from Earth, door to door, could span a decade and a half. And during the return, the crew faces every challenge of the outbound journey in reverse, but with a crucial difference. The spacecraft is older. Its systems have been operating continuously for years. Components that were new at launch are now worn. Consumables that were abundant at departure are now depleted or running low. The statistical probability of a critical failure increases with every additional year of operation. The crew is returning in a vehicle that is demonstrably less reliable than the one they departed in, across a distance that still precludes any rescue. This is a point that popular discussions of deep space missions rarely address. The outbound journey is dangerous. The return journey is more dangerous. Not because the distance is greater, it is the same distance, but because the vehicle is degraded. Every mechanical system has a lifespan. Seals crack. Bearings wear. Electronics accumulate radiation damage. Software develops subtle bugs that compound over time. A spacecraft designed for a 15-year mission is not the same spacecraft at year 12 that it was at year 1. It is a machine running on borrowed time, maintained by a crew that has been performing maintenance for over a decade, with a finite supply of replacement parts and no possibility of resupply. The history of long-duration spaceflight offers glimpses of what this looks like. The Russian space station Mir operated for 15 years, from 1986 to 2001. During its final years, Mir experienced increasingly frequent system failures. A fire broke out in 1997. A collision with a Progress cargo vehicle punctured one of the station's modules. Life support systems required constant improvisation. The station's late career reliability issues were manageable because it was in low Earth orbit, where resupply missions could deliver replacement parts every few months, and crew rotations brought fresh expertise. A Saturn-bound spacecraft would experience the same aging effects with none of the same support infrastructure. When systems begin to fail in year 8 or year 10, the crew cannot order new parts. They must cannibalize, improvise, and hope. This also means the crew must carry an extraordinary breadth of skills. On the space station, astronauts are specialists. They have specific training in specific systems, supplemented by ground-based experts who can provide detailed guidance on any problem. A Saturn crew cannot rely on ground-based experts in real time. They must collectively possess the knowledge and skill to diagnose and repair every major system on the spacecraft, perform medical procedures including surgery, manage psychological crises within their small group, conduct the scientific work that justifies the mission, navigate the spacecraft through complex orbital maneuvers, and make life or death decisions without external validation. They must be engineers, doctors, scientists, mechanics, counselors, and commanders simultaneously, for years without relief. No human crew has ever been asked to do this. The closest analogues are not spaceflight missions but historical expeditions of extreme isolation. The voyages of polar explorers like Shackleton and Amundsen, the overwintering crews at Antarctic research stations, the crews of nuclear submarines on extended patrols. These experiences share some characteristics with a Saturn mission: isolation, confinement, reliance on limited resources, the impossibility of rapid rescue, but none of them approach the duration or the totality of separation that a Saturn mission would impose. Shackleton's crew was stranded on Antarctic ice for nearly 2 years, and the ordeal nearly destroyed them physically and psychologically. A Saturn crew would face 5 to 7 times that duration in an environment far more hostile and far more remote. There is another dimension to the collapse of Earth-based support that goes beyond emergencies. It is the slow erosion of institutional relevance. On current space missions, ground teams play an active role in daily operations. They plan schedules, review data, monitor spacecraft health, and provide ongoing scientific direction. They are partners in the mission, working alongside the crew in something close to real time. At Saturn distance, this partnership dissolves. Ground teams can still review data and offer recommendations, but everything they send is hours old by the time it arrives. Their scheduling suggestions are based on information that is already outdated. Their scientific priorities may have been overtaken by events the crew has already observed and responded to. The crew, by necessity, becomes self-directing. They set their own priorities, make their own operational decisions, and manage their own time. Earth becomes an advisor that is perpetually behind, offering counsel that is perpetually late. This is not a criticism of ground teams. It is a structural consequence of the delay, and it has a subtle but profound effect on the crew's psychological relationship with Earth. As Earth's operational relevance fades, so does the crew's sense of being part of a larger enterprise. On the station, astronauts feel embedded in a global team. They are part of something. Their work is monitored, supported, and celebrated in something close to real time. A Saturn crew would gradually lose that sense of embeddedness. Their reports would be sent into silence and acknowledged hours later. Their achievements would be celebrated on Earth long after the moment had passed. Their struggles would be observed from a distance too great for meaningful intervention. Over time, the crew would begin to feel less like participants in a shared mission, and more like castaways sending messages in bottles, hoping someone finds them but no longer expecting a reply that changes anything. And beneath all of this, beneath the operational isolation and the medical vulnerability and the communication collapse and the impossibility of rescue and the interpersonal pressure and the slow degradation of every physical system keeping the crew alive, lies the most unsettling truth of all. The crew would not be prisoners. They would not be victims of a disaster that stranded them against their will. They would be volunteers. They would have chosen this mission knowing everything described in this story so far. They would have trained for it, prepared for it, accepted it. And somewhere in the transit, somewhere in the long, quiet months between Earth and Saturn, they would have to make peace with the fact that no amount of training can fully prepare a human mind to absorb. Nobody is coming. Not if the reactor fails. Not if the oxygen recycler breaks down. Not if someone gets sick. Not if the hull is breached. Not if everything goes wrong at once. Nobody is coming because nobody can come. The distance is too great. The transit too long. The physics too absolute. The crew is alone in a way that no human beings have ever been alone before. Not stranded on a desert island where a passing ship might appear. Not lost in a wilderness where a search party might eventually arrive. Alone at a scale where the word alone requires a new definition, one that accounts for the fact that the nearest human beings capable of helping are years of travel time away, and cannot even learn about the emergency for over an hour after it happens. This is the operational reality of a Saturn mission, not the pretty rings and golden atmosphere and scientific wonders that fill the proposal documents, not the heroic imagery of astronauts planting flags on Titan's frozen surface. The reality is a crew sealed inside a machine that must not fail, surrounded by a void that cannot be crossed quickly, communicating with a world that cannot respond in time, sustained by systems that must function perfectly for longer than most machines on Earth are expected to last, with no backup, no escape, and no rescue. Every previous human spaceflight has operated within a safety net. That net has sometimes been thin. It has sometimes been tested, but it has always existed. At Saturn, the net is gone, not frayed, not weakened, not distant. Gone. The crew operates without it, for years, in the most remote environment any human being has ever inhabited. And that operational isolation, that knowledge that Earth can observe but cannot intervene, that the crew is its own last line of defense against every possible failure, produces something that goes beyond physical danger. It produces a psychological condition that has no historical precedent. A condition where home is not merely far away but fundamentally unable to reach you. Where Earth is not merely distant but functionally powerless. Where the people who love you can hear your voice, but only after it has travelled for over an hour through the void, and their reply will take just as long to return. And in the gap between those two signals, you are utterly, completely, irreducibly alone. What that condition does to the human mind, what it means to live inside that silence for years, is the last truth this story has to tell. It is where distance stops being a measurement and becomes a transformation, where Saturn stops being a destination and becomes a threshold, and where the phrase "would never see Earth again" reveals its full and terrible meaning. There is a photograph that every human being should see at least once. It was taken on July 19th, 2013, by the Cassini spacecraft from a position roughly 898 million miles from Earth. In the image, Saturn dominates the frame, its rings backlit by the distant sun, glowing with an ethereal translucence that makes the planet look less like a world and more like a vision. And there, below the rings, almost invisible against the blackness, is a tiny pale blue dot. That dot is Earth. Every person you have ever loved, every city you have ever visited, every sunrise and heartbreak and moment of laughter that has ever occurred in the history of your species is contained within that single pixel of light. NASA told people in advance that Cassini would be photographing Earth from Saturn that day. They encouraged everyone to go outside and wave at the sky. Over 20,000 people submitted images of themselves waving at Saturn. They smiled and held up signs and pointed toward a planet they could not see with their naked eyes. The event was charming and hopeful and a little bit silly, but there was something else buried in that moment, something nobody said out loud. The camera that took the photograph was a machine. It did not experience the distance. It did not feel the silence between itself and the dot it was photographing. It captured an image that revealed Earth's smallness from Saturn, without experiencing what that smallness would mean to a conscious mind that needed Earth to be large and close and reachable. A human crew at Saturn would see what Cassini saw. They would look back toward the inner solar system and search for Earth, and they would find, if they found it at all, a point of light so faint it would vanish into the starfield without a computer to mark its position. Not a world, not a home, not even a disk. A dot, a mathematical coordinate where something important used to be visible, and in that moment, something would shift inside them that no training protocol can simulate and no psychological preparation can fully anticipate. Because human beings do not merely know where home is, they feel it, they orient themselves toward it. They carry it in their bodies as a direction, a pull, a baseline against which all other locations are measured. And when home shrinks to a point of light indistinguishable from the background stars, that orientation collapses. You do not lose your home. You lose the feeling of having one. Psychologists who study isolation in extreme environments have documented this phenomenon in miniature among people who have never left Earth. Antarctic overwinterers, submarine crews on extended deployments, researchers in simulated Mars habitats, all report a version of the same experience. As weeks turn to months, the outside world begins to feel less real, not intellectually. They know the world exists. They receive messages from it. They think about it constantly. But the lived sensation of belonging to that world, the feeling that you are part of its rhythms, its weather, its moods, its passing time, begins to fade. Researchers call this detachment. Astronauts on the International Space Station occasionally describe a milder version, a sense that Earth, despite being visible through the windows, has become something they observe rather than something they inhabit. They are above it. They are separate from it. They watch it, but they do not touch it. Now amplify this by every measure. Remove the window that shows Earth as a recognizable sphere and replace it with a void where Earth is invisible to the naked eye. Extend the duration from months to years. Replace near instantaneous communication with a delay so long that every message arrives from the past and every reply departs into a future you cannot share. Remove the possibility of return within any time frame that feels real. Remove the possibility of rescue under any circumstances. Remove every physical tether, every operational connection, every sensory confirmation that Earth is still there and still yours. What remains is not isolation in any sense that existing psychology has fully studied. It is exile. Not the political kind, where a person is expelled from one place but remains on the same planet, embedded in the same flow of time, capable of hearing the news and walking the streets and breathing the same air as every other human being on Earth. This is a different kind. This is exile by distance, enforced by physics, measured in light minutes and years of transit, and defined by a single devastating characteristic. The exiled person can still communicate with home, but the communication has been stripped of everything that makes it feel like presence. Presence is the word that matters. It is the quality that separates a living relationship from a remembered one. When you talk to someone in real time, you are present to each other. You share the same moment. Your words land while the context that produced them still exists. You can interrupt. You can adjust. You can feel the other person reacting and react in turn. Presence is not just proximity. It is temporal alignment. Two people sharing the same now. At Saturn distance, temporal alignment is destroyed. A crew member records a message for their partner on Earth. It is an ordinary message, how their day went, what they ate, a small observation about the way Saturn's rings catch the light during orbital sunrise. They send it. 78 minutes later, it arrives on Earth. Their partner listens, smiles, cries perhaps, records a reply. That reply travels for another 78 minutes. The crew member receives it over 2.5 hours after their original message was sent. By then, the moment is gone. The emotional state that produced the original message has dissolved. The crew member is in a different headspace, working a different task, maybe sleeping. The reply arrives into a context that no longer exists. It is not a conversation. It is two people leaving messages for versions of each other that have already moved on. Over months and years, this asynchrony becomes the defining texture of every relationship the crew maintains with Earth. Nothing is shared in real time. No experience is mutual. No joke lands at the right moment. No comfort arrives when it is needed. Everything is offset, delayed, displaced from the emotional context in which it was created. The crew learns to live with this. They adapt, because human beings are remarkably adaptable. But adaptation is not the same as wholeness. A person who adapts to the loss of a limb is not the same as a person who never lost one. A person who adapts to the loss of temporal presence with every human being they love is not the same as a person who still has it. Something fundamental has been altered. The alteration does not kill them. It does not necessarily break them, but it changes them in ways that no mission debrief can fully reverse. The research on long-duration isolation offers some clues about what this change looks like. Studies of Antarctic overwinterers, some of the most rigorous analog research available, have documented a pattern that psychologists sometimes call the third quarter phenomenon. Roughly 3/4 of the way through an isolated posting, morale and cognitive performance tend to drop sharply. Crew members who maintained good spirits through the first month suddenly become irritable, withdrawn, and prone to conflict. Sleep patterns deteriorate, motivation declines. The phenomenon appears even in crews that are well selected, well trained, and well supported, because it is not primarily caused by external conditions. It is caused by the psychological weight of knowing that the isolation is not yet over, and that the remaining duration still feels substantial. Now consider what the third quarter phenomenon would look like on a Saturn mission. If the total round-trip duration is 12 years, the third quarter arrives at year 9. By that point, the crew has been away from Earth for the better part of a decade. They have spent years in transit, years at Saturn, and they are somewhere in the long return journey, still years from home. The world they left behind has changed enormously. Their children, if they had children, have grown from young people into adults who have built lives that do not include daily interaction with an absent parent. Their friends have moved, married, divorced, changed careers. The political and cultural context they departed from has evolved in ways they could only partially follow through delayed transmissions. They are returning to a world they no longer fully recognize, and they are still years away from reaching it. The third quarter effect in this scenario would not be a dip in morale. It would be a confrontation with the full weight of what the mission has cost them. The realization, arriving with the force of accumulated years, that the life they left behind is not waiting for them. It has continued without them. It has changed without them. And when they finally return, they will step off the spacecraft into a world where they are strangers carrying memories of a place that no longer exists. This is the deepest form of the exile, not the inability to communicate, though that is devastating. Not the impossibility of rescue, though that is terrifying. The deepest exile is temporal. It is the knowledge that time has passed differently for the crew than for everyone they love. Not in the relativistic sense, though at the velocities involved in a Saturn transit there would be a tiny relativistic time dilation effect, far too small to matter. In the experiential sense, the crew has lived through the same years as their families on Earth, but they have lived through them in a fundamentally different context. They have not shared meals, they have not attended birthdays, they have not argued about small things or reconciled over coffee. They have not been present for the 1,000 unremarkable moments that constitute a relationship. They have been present only through messages, delayed and asynchronous, arriving like letters from a distant century. There is a concept in philosophy called the ship of Theseus. If you replace every plank of a ship, one at a time, is it still the same ship? The Saturn crew would face a version of this paradox applied to their own identities and relationships. If every shared experience between you and your family is replaced by a delayed transmission, if every argument and reconciliation is mediated by a 3-hour round-trip delay, if every milestone is observed after the fact through a recorded video rather than witnessed in person, are you still part of that family in the same way? The legal answer is yes. The emotional answer is more complicated. The crew would remain connected to their families by love, by history, by commitment, but the living substance of that connection, the daily, embodied, temporally shared reality of being in each other's lives, would have been replaced, plank by plank, by something thinner, something that resembles connection but lacks its weight, something that carries the shape of a relationship without the warmth of presence. Astronauts who have spent 6 months to a year on the International Space Station report that reintegration into family life is one of the most difficult aspects of the mission. Despite near real-time communication and a relatively short absence, they describe feeling out of step with their families. Routines have changed. Roles have shifted. The family learned to function without them, and their return disrupts the new equilibrium. These difficulties are real but manageable because the absence is measured in months. A Saturn crew would return after a decade or more. The disruption would not be a temporary adjustment, it would be a fundamental renegotiation of identity. Who are you when you return to a world that has spent 15 years learning to live without you? Who are you when your children are adults you did not watch grow up? Who are you when the person who loved you at departure has, through no one's fault, become a different person than the one you remember? These questions do not have clean answers. They are the kind of questions that erode certainty and resist closure, and they would greet every returning Saturn crew member the moment they step back onto Earth's surface, blinking in sunlight that feels both familiar and foreign. But perhaps the most unsettling dimension of the exile is not what happens to the crew's relationships with other people. It is what happens to their relationship with Earth itself. Earth is not merely a location for human beings. It is the context in which human consciousness evolved. Every sensory system in our bodies is tuned to Earth's environment. Our eyes are calibrated to its light spectrum. Our inner ears are designed for its gravity. Our circadian rhythms are synchronized to its 24-hour rotation. Our psychology is shaped by its landscapes, its seasons, its weather, its sounds. Earth is not just where we live. It is what we are. We are expressions of this planet's conditions, biological instruments shaped by 4 billion years of evolution to function within its parameters. A crew at Saturn would be separated from all of this, not just from the people on Earth, but from the planet itself, from gravity, from open sky, from wind and rain and the feel of soil underfoot, from the smell of air that has been processed by forests and oceans rather than by mechanical scrubbers, from the sound of birds, of traffic, of children playing, of all the ambient noise that the human brain uses to construct its sense of being in the world. These absences might seem trivial compared to the grand challenges of radiation and life support and communication delay. They are not. They are the texture of sanity. Human beings who are deprived of natural sensory environments for extended periods develop measurable cognitive and emotional changes. Windowless environments increase depression. Monotonous soundscapes increase anxiety. The absence of natural light disrupts hormonal regulation. These effects are documented in settings as ordinary as offices and submarines. In a spacecraft that has been the crew's entire world for a decade, they would be inescapable. The crew would attempt to compensate. They would carry recordings of Earth sounds. They would display images of landscapes on their habitat screens. They might grow small plants under artificial light, as crews on the station do, drawing comfort from the simple presence of something green and alive. But compensation is not replacement. You cannot replicate the feeling of standing on a hillside in the wind by playing a recording of wind through a speaker in a metal corridor. The sensory impoverishment of a Saturn mission would accumulate quietly, year after year, contributing to a baseline of psychological erosion that no single intervention can fully counteract. And through all of this, through the delay and the isolation and the temporal exile and the sensory deprivation and the impossibility of rescue, there would be Saturn itself. Enormous and beautiful and utterly indifferent to the humans who came so far to see it. Saturn does not care that you travelled for 7 years to reach it. Its rings do not shine more brightly because human eyes are watching. Its storms do not pause for human contemplation. Titan's methane lakes do not ripple with welcome. The Saturn system is a collection of physical processes operating according to the laws of physics, and it would continue those processes whether humans were present or not. The crew would be visitors in a place that did not invite them, sustained by machines that were never meant to last this long, communicating with a world that can hear them but cannot reach them. This brings us to the title, why the first humans to reach Saturn would never see Earth again. The statement is not a prediction of mission failure. It is not a claim that the crew would die before returning. It is a description of what distance does to perception, to connection, to the lived experience of having a home. The crew would not see Earth again because Earth, as they knew it, would cease to exist for them during the mission, not the physical planet. The physical planet would continue orbiting the Sun, rotating on its axis, supporting its billions of inhabitants. But the Earth that was home, the Earth of immediate connection, of shared time, of reachable safety, of sensory familiarity, would be gone from the moment the communication delay crossed the threshold where conversation became impossible. The crew would carry a version of Earth in their memories, but memory is static and life is not. The Earth in their minds would freeze at the moment of departure, while the real Earth continued changing. By the time they returned, if they returned, the Earth they remembered and the Earth that existed would be two different places, and the crew would belong fully to neither. This is what the distance creates. Not death, not disaster. Something quieter, and in some ways worse. A slow, irreversible separation between a human being and the world that made them. A transformation of home from something you inhabit into something you recall. A crossing from the part of the solar system where Earth is a living presence into the part where Earth is an abstraction, a data point, a faint signal arriving late from a place you can no longer touch. Saturn is not the edge of the solar system. Beyond it lies Uranus at roughly 19 astronomical units, Neptune at 30. The Kuiper belt extends to 50 astronomical units and beyond. The hypothesized Oort cloud stretches perhaps 50,000 astronomical units from the Sun, nearly a light-year into interstellar space. Saturn, at 9.5 astronomical units, is barely a step beyond the inner planets on the scale of the full solar system, and yet it is already far enough to break every assumption human beings hold about the reachability of home. And here is the fact that closes the door on the hope that technology will eventually solve this problem. It will not. Not because our engineers are insufficient, not because our science is too primitive, because the exile at Saturn is not caused by slow ships. It is caused by the speed of light. Propulsion technology may improve. Transit times may shrink. Perhaps someday a crew could reach Saturn in 1 year instead of 7. Perhaps in 2 instead of 5. Faster engines would reduce the duration of the journey, shorten the period of physical deterioration, compress the years of escalating delay during transit. That would be a meaningful improvement. But it would not touch the core of the problem, because the moment that faster ship arrives at Saturn, the crew would still be 70 to 90 minutes from hearing any human voice on Earth. The round-trip exchange would still consume nearly 3 hours. A rescue vehicle launched from Earth would still take years to arrive. The communication collapse, the temporal exile, the impossibility of intervention, all of it would be identical to what a slower ship's crew experienced upon arrival. Faster transit delivers the crew to the same silence more quickly. It does not reduce the silence itself. This is because the delay at Saturn is not an engineering limitation. It is a geometric fact. Saturn orbits the Sun at 9.5 astronomical units. Light travels at 300,000 kilometers per second. No signal, no instruction, no human voice can cross that distance in less than 70 minutes under the best orbital alignment. This is not a barrier that cleverer technology can lower. It is a property of the universe. The speed of light is not a speed limit in the sense that a highway has a speed limit, an arbitrary rule that could be revised. It is the fundamental rate at which causality itself propagates through space-time. Nothing in our universe, no information, no signal, no physical influence of any kind, moves faster. This has been confirmed by over a century of experimental physics and has never been violated by any observation. This makes Saturn fundamentally different from Mars in a way that faster ships cannot bridge. At Mars, improving propulsion helps twice. A faster transit reduces both the journey duration and the communication delay during the journey, because the ship spends less time at intermediate distances where delay is growing. And upon arrival at Mars, the communication delay is only 4 to 22 minutes, short enough that something resembling conversation is still possible, short enough that mission control can contribute to emergency response within the same hour. Faster ships make Mars missions genuinely less isolated at every phase. At Saturn, faster ships help only with the transit phase. They compress the outbound and return journeys. But upon arrival, the crew enters the same fixed communication environment regardless of how they got there. 70 to 90 minutes of one-way delay, 2.5 to 3 hours for a round trip. No rescue possible in less than years. These conditions are not features of our current technological era. They are features of Saturn's position in the solar system, and Saturn's position is not going to change. This means the exile described in this story is not a temporary problem that future generations will look back on and smile at, the way we smile at the idea that crossing the Atlantic once took months. The Atlantic did not get smaller. Ships got faster, and the crossing shrank to days, then hours. But the Atlantic's width was never the fundamental barrier, it was the speed of the ships. At Saturn, the fundamental barrier is not the speed of the ships, it is the speed of light, and the speed of light is not going to increase. A civilization 1,000 years more advanced than ours, with propulsion systems we cannot yet imagine, would still face the same 70-minute signal delay upon reaching Saturn. They would still be unable to have a real-time conversation with Earth. They would still be beyond rescue. They would still experience the same temporal exile, the same communication collapse, the same slow transformation of home into memory. The exile at Saturn is permanent. It is built into the architecture of the solar system and sealed by the deepest law of physics we know. No amount of progress changes what Saturn's distance does to the human experience of connection. The distance is the message, and the message does not change. That is the terrifying truth embedded in this story. You do not need to leave the solar system to enter exile. You do not need to cross interstellar distances to lose contact with Earth in any way that matters. Saturn is close enough that we can see it with our naked eyes on a clear night. Close enough that we have sent robots there and back. Close enough that we can photograph its rings in stunning detail and map its moons and study its atmosphere from over 1 billion miles away. And it is far enough that a human crew who travelled there would cross into a form of remoteness that has no precedent in human history. A remoteness where communication is monologue, where rescue is fiction, where return takes years, and where the world you came from fades into a delayed signal that arrives too late to share and too faint to hold. The first humans to reach Saturn would be extraordinary people. Brave, brilliant, physically resilient, psychologically robust, trained for every conceivable scenario. They would carry the best technology humanity could provide. They would represent the apex of human exploration, the farthest any member of our species had ever travelled from the planet of our birth. They would see things no human eye has ever seen. Saturn's rings from within the ring plane, Titan's orange sky from beneath its methane clouds, the geysers of Enceladus erupting against the blackness of space. They would add to the sum of human knowledge in ways that would resonate for centuries. But they would pay for it with something that cannot be measured in scientific papers or mission reports. They would pay with their connection to the present tense of human life on Earth. They would pay with years of silence, years of delayed messages from a world that was moving on without them, years of knowing that the people they loved were living lives they could observe but not share. They would pay with the slow transformation of home from a place into a memory, from a living presence into a fading signal, from something they could return to into something they could only remember. And when they finally came home, if they came home, they would step onto a planet that had aged 1.5 decades without them. They would breathe real air and feel real gravity and hear real birds for the first time in years. And they would look around at a world that was both deeply familiar and profoundly strange. And they would understand in their bones what the rest of us can only understand intellectually. That the solar system is not a neighbourhood, it is an ocean. And Saturn is the point where the shore disappears behind you and the depth beneath you becomes something you can feel but not measure. The first humans to reach Saturn would not simply travel far from home. They would cross into a region of space where home stops being something you can get back to in time for it to still be yours. Where Earth does not vanish from the sky but vanishes from the present. Where the world you love is still there, still shining, still sending signals through the dark, but is no longer something you live inside. It is something you carry, a light you remember, a voice that arrives late, a place that was once real and has become, across 800 million miles of silence, something closer to a dream you had before the crossing began.